Let's start by optimizing this chair for texturing. Switch to edit mode and you'll see some edges that aren't necessary for the geometry or visual quality. You can easily select them with Alt and Alt-Shift, then delete them with Ctrl-X. This will stretch the UVs, but that's not an issue since we'll re-unwrap everything later. Now, we have parallel edges here. Instead of selecting each one individually, let's work smarter. Switch to Face Select mode, then to Wireframe mode. Select these faces and with Alt and Shift add the adjacent ones to your selection. Then go to Select, select Loops, select Boundary Loops, and isolate just the edges. Delete them with Ctrl-X. Up top, there's also some unnecessary geometry on the seat. Go back to Face Select mode. Selecting a face automatically selects its edges, so switch to Edge Select mode and hit Ctrl-X. Now the chair is optimized and ready for unwrapping and texturing. Before we dive into unwrapping, let's clarify some basics about wood unwrapping. Since we're dealing with a wooden chair, it's crucial to understand how wood behaves in real life. If you look at 99% of images of wooden beams, you'll see that the grain always runs along the length of the beam. I can click through almost any reference image and it's consistently the case. Very rarely, for stylistic or design reasons, it's done differently. But in 99% of cases, the wood grain follows the length of the beam. And that's exactly what we need to keep in mind during unwrapping. Now that we've clarified the wood grain, let's start unwrapping. You can see this rule was also applied to this chair. But since I plan to make the chair white, turquoise and white again, mostly painted with just subtle wood grain, it doesn't matter as much. The important thing is to avoid overlaps, so I'll press U and select Unwrap Angle Based. I notice this island still doesn't have a mark seam. I press Ctrl-E, Mark Seam, set the seam around this face, and unwrap Angle Based again. Blender usually tries to align islands based on length, which isn't ideal for wood. Ideally, I'd rotate it once. But since I'll repaint and texture it anyway, I can set the grain vertically later. I want a pixel density of 3 to 5. The Texel Density add-on shows I'm currently at 3.5, which is acceptable but could be pushed to 4. The main issue is this long beam limiting the others. In the TexTools add-on, I can straighten it with Rectify. Just select one UV face of the UV island and select the whole UV island with Ctrl-L afterward. You need to do this to have an active face because Rectify uses this as the base to straighten it. After that's done, hit Rectify. That makes texturing easier later. I'll move it somewhere convenient, making sure it doesn't extend beyond the UV space. Since the seat areas will be turquoise and the rest white, I'll focus on the white parts first. Since we're texturing manually, not in Substance Painter, the islands that belong together are too scattered. I'll manually group them. For example, these struts are all similar. They'll get shadows on the right and left. With text tools, I'll select them, switch to face select mode, and use align vertices or edges and shells to stack them. It is important that we are in face select mode, not in vertex or edge select mode, because that collapses the UVs to a tiny vertex point. Then I'll move these parallel parts together. I'll select everything, move this up, and group the similar ones. They'll be darker at the top and bottom due to shading, but otherwise identical. I'll use text tools to align and sort. V, sort vertically to stack them by size. Now, I'll manually push the islands around to maximize texel density. I won't introduce anything new, just manual adjustments. Once I'm done, I'll explain the next steps. Now that the UV islands are sorted, I'll check the texel density for the larger scaled areas. I'm now at 3.8, up from 3.5. That's a solid improvement. The top islands are still at 3.5. So, after clicking Calculate Texel Density, I'll use Calc Set Value to grab this value. Then, I'll use Set My Texel Density to scale those up to match the rest. This makes for a very balanced chair. Of course, for critical areas like the seat, since it's large, visible, and prominent, you can scale those islands slightly bigger than the others. But this one is way too big, so I'd rather waste a little UV space and leave it as is. I'll just add a bit of distance for easier editing later. The UV map is now done. Next up, baking. Now, let's move on to baking the ambient occlusion. To bake the ambient occlusion, go to Render. Switch the render engine to cycles. And then, under Bake, change the bake type to ambient occlusion. That should work right away. Let's give it a try. Since the texture is only 512 pixels, it bakes really fast. In 3D, the object looks flawless, no unwanted black spots anywhere. This is good to go. To save the ambient occlusion, go to Image, Save As, and give it a meaningful name like chair_AO at the end. For better workflow, it's also useful to export the UV layout. Switch to Edit mode. Go to UV layout, and then Export UV layout. Since the name is different, you won't overwrite anything. Just click Export UV layout. That's it for this section. Let's finally start texturing. I already have the ambient occlusion open in paint.net. Just make sure we're working with a 512 by 512 texture. If the size isn't right, press Ctrl+R and adjust the image dimensions. Now I'll open the UV layout as a new layer and also open the downloaded textures and the desired white wood texture. But not as layers, just open them since I'll need them again later. I'll start with the base wood texture as it's the bottom layer. I'll select everything, press Ctrl+C to copy, click the plus icon to add a new layer, and then Ctrl+V to paste. Make sure to select Keep Canvas Size, not Expand, to avoid enlarging the texture. Then I'll scale it down a bit. Holding Shift keeps the scaling proportional. Next, I'll add another layer for the turquoise texture. Again, keep canvas size and scale it down. Scaling down helps reduce visible damage and dirt on the texture, and it also minimizes JPEG artifacts. When scaling, always use bicubic sampling for the best quality. For retro textures, nearest neighbor is only used in Blender, otherwise the image looks too pixelated. I'll copy the white texture, paste it above the turquoise layer, and adjust its position and scale as needed. The basic setup is almost done. One last thing. I like to overlay the ambient occlusion on all textures. Just double-click the ambient occlusion layer, set the blend mode to multiply, and you'll already see the shapes of the objects we're working on. Now I'll start adding some details, like setting highlights at the corners and shading deeper areas a bit. I'll also do some wood carving. It's pretty straightforward. I take my UV layer and lower its opacity a bit so I can see through it easily. Then, above the ambient occlusion, I add a new layer. I go to the Line and Curve tool, set the brush size to 3, and start drawing lines around the edges. In my case, and this might happen to you too, I can't see anything right now. That's because there's still an active selection. You can only paint within the selection, so just grab the selection tool, click somewhere empty, and the selection will disappear. Then switch back to the Line tool and start again. Since I want to highlight this area, I'll right-click to draw white lines. Now, fast forwarding a bit, because there's quite a lot to do here. I'll try to copy these lines over here, since it's basically the same shape. The easiest way is to duplicate the layer, move it with the Move tool, and then merge the layers again. I'm done with shading and highlights. I'll hide the UV layout to see what I'm doing more clearly. The highlights are usually set to overlay blend mode, but right now light on light makes them hard to see. You could also use add or reflect, but I'll stick with overlay for now. We'll see the difference soon. I'll duplicate the highlights layer and hide the copy for now, using the original one below. I go to Effects, then Blur, and select Gaussian Blur. Here I can adjust the blur strength. I'll set the lower blur quite strong, let's say 8. Click OK. The blur almost disappears on the bright spots, but is still visible elsewhere. Now I'll enable the duplicated layer, which is also set to overlay. And repeat the process. This time I'll reduce the blur radius maybe to 3. This way I can independently control the highlight intensity, one soft, one strong. I'll set the stronger one to about 90 and the very soft one to 100. So it doesn't stand out too much. What I want to adjust overall is the white. It's too pure. Use hue saturation and then fine-tune it with hue. I'll make it a bit more yellow, increase the saturation, and darken it slightly to make the material look older. Now the highlights are more visible again. For the shadows, I'll use multiply blend mode and follow the same steps. I'll duplicate the shadow layer, take the lower one, and set a higher blur. Maybe 10 this time. Let's see if reflect actually looks better here. You can see a slight effect with reflect. I'll use reflect for the very smooth shadow and leave the top one less blurred. I'll experiment with blend modes, but multiply is definitely the way to go. I'll just adjust the opacity. If you want to add more, just create another layer, draw some lines, and repeat the process. Let's continue with variations in the textures and wear marks on the seat surface. I select a highlight layer and go to Effects, then Distort and choose Dense. As you can see, the effect is a bit too strong. We can adjust the scale here or reduce the refraction value slightly to add some variation to the texture. Just so it doesn't look too perfect. I'll use a slightly larger effect here, which I'll apply to the rough shadow as well, not the fine shadow. Up here I can just click Repeat Dance. For the fine shadow and fine highlights, I'll reopen the dance window by clicking here again and then adjust the scale. Now we have some small variations, but of course it's not enough yet. Later we erase some areas after working on the seat surface, but for now we focus on the wear marks. Pick the turquoise layer from the seat surface and just use the eraser to remove some areas. The eraser is set a bit too strong, so I'll adjust the settings. Hardness to 0 for a very soft edge, and a relatively large brush size. Down here, I'll set the opacity to 80, so it doesn't erase too much. Now I can add some wear marks with a few strokes, making it look like the seat is slowly wearing through. Next, I'll switch to my shadow layer and use the brush. It's set to black by default and keep the opacity at 80. This applies to the brush as well. Here I can darken some areas a bit more. When I draw, I lift the brush after each stroke. Each individual click reapplies the brush value. Let me quickly show you what I mean. I use a white layer. I draw with low opacity, just adding black lines. And you can see, as long as I keep painting over the same spot without lifting, you see it by the yellow dot, holding the button down the whole time, it doesn't overwrite itself. But if I lift and paint again, it does overwrite. I can keep doing this over and over until it's completely black. I'll do the same for the shadows. It works just as well for the wear marks, which I'll also enhance a bit. If you ever go overboard with the wear, just grab the clone brush, hold Ctrl and click to sample, then paint back over from here. Try not to go over the edge, but in this case it's not a big deal since it copies from the layer, not what you see. The important thing is that the texture stays intact. It simply copies the colors from here to there. Now I'll set my brush to a small size, make it a bit harder and increase the opacity. I want to add small damage around the seed area like chipped paint. Mostly here at the front where the legs are, and less here. Always think about how the object is used. This is where the seat meets the legs and maybe some flaking around the holes where the sticks go in. But mainly the paint would chip around the legs. Since it's a hard edge, that's where most of the damage happens. I'll reduce the frequency here and maybe lower the opacity again. Of course, I can also make the brush smaller for finer details. Don't forget the corners. Damage shouldn't just be at the top, it should be consistent. To check which edges are at the front, I'll quickly jump into Blender. With UV Sync selection enabled, this icon here, I can select the vertices and see if the UV island is rotated correctly. If it were flipped, I'd know to paint at the bottom, but since it matches, I'll focus on painting at the top. I'll turn the UV layer back on to see what I'm working with. For example, this area here corresponds to the inner surface, so I'll add more damage there. The back will have less. I'll add stronger details soon. We'll check in Blender if this is enough or if more needs to be added, but for now, this section is good. Next, I'll break up some of the regular patterns and add some nails. Let's get back to Blender. Now I want to add nails in places where it makes sense, like on these crossbars. I'll add a nail at the bottom of each backrest section. I'll copy this mask over later. I need to plan carefully to know where to place the nails. These parts won't get any nails, especially since there are already details here. Nails look better on flat surfaces, not so much in corners. And of course, having a seam here is a problem. I should have caught that earlier. I can't place a nail over a seam in paint.net without it looking bad. So what can I do? First, I'll select this surface and see. This area here, where these two parts meet, will have ambient occlusion. That means if I click here, the exact opposite side will be there. I'll keep that in mind. For this part, there are two gaps, then the nail. Ambient occlusion, gap, gap, nail. It's the same piece, so ambient occlusion, gap, gap, nail. And here it's probably the same. Ambient occlusion, gap, gap, nail. Let me test it. Ambient occlusion, here's where the nail would go, right opposite, and it fits. so it's the single ambient occlusion in the middle, not the one at the edge. That means a nail should go directly opposite there. Of course, I could also mark this in Blender using texture paint mode for extra safety. Or even add the nail via a texture mask and paint it in. That would probably work decently here, but I want to do everything in paint.net right now, so I'll stick with that. Switching back to paint.net, I already downloaded a nail image. I'll open a new file, it was in the clipboard. For example, a brass colored nail. Now I'll mask this nail. I'll use the magic wand, click on the white and adjust the tolerance to control how much it selects. This works well here. Everything else disappears. Make sure everything is selected. I'll press Ctrl C to copy it with transparency to the clipboard. Then I'll start adding these nails over my wood texture so they also get highlights and shading later. As I said, this one should go here, exactly opposite. I'll copy it so I don't have to keep resizing. I'll press Ctrl C, Ctrl V again. So I'll add nails here too, and then we'll do something special with them. But first I'll copy this background ambient occlusion select just this part and move it over to match the other seat. I'll compare the two seats. This should fit roughly. I'll leave it like this for now and delete it later. It's just for reference. Then I can take the layer with my nails and continue. I'll paste in a nail and move it up to the holes I see here. That can stay for now. Now I'll delete that reference. The nails are in place. Theoretically, I could also duplicate this layer and move it from the right side to the top of the chair for the big feet. I'm not sure how that'll look, maybe it's too much, but I'll try it anyway, since I can always delete it later. If it's hard to see, I can temporarily lower the opacity of the ambient occlusion. Now I'll delete that background again and everything is back to how it was. These nails are quite prominent. I'll duplicate the nail layer and turn it off for a moment. I don't have to turn it off, but it's easier to see what I'm doing. I'll take the layer below the copied nails, go to Adjustment, and first make it black and white. Now all the nails are black and white. Then I'll go to Brightness, Contrast. And lower both all the way down. Now the nails are almost black. Next I'll add a Gaussian blur and increase the blur a bit. If I turn the nails back on, you can see a small shadow around them. I'll rename this layer. I can also change the blend mode to something that looks better. Glow doesn't look bad. Does glow work for the white parts too? Yes, I'll make it a bit lighter. Now we have a shadow around the nails. Of course, I can still rotate each nail individually for more variation, but it won't be very noticeable. While we're shading, I can also do what I mentioned earlier. I'll show it again in Blender, shading these corners of the sticks. I wanted to shade here and here too. I've only added details but not the shading yet, so I'll go to my shadow layer, but I'll create a new layer above it, so I don't overwrite anything. I'll call it Strong Shadows and set it to multiply with low opacity. Then I'll start at the top, use the rectangle shape, set it to draw filled shape so there's no outline. And make sure it's set to black. I'll adjust my layout a bit to see the lines better and turn off the ambient occlusion. It's misleading. Without it, I can see the actual geometry. Now, I'll paint in my boxes. It's important that we don't draw black shapes at the bottom, only here at the top, because there will naturally be less shadow down there than up here. So back in PaintNet, I'll use the select tool again. Then I can select all the shapes. Some areas need to be more precise so they don't blur over other elements. For example, this spot might cause issues. I'll fix that later. Now I'll go to Effects, then Blur, and use the same blur effect again. I'll apply a pretty strong blur here. I'll do the same over here and then just click Repeat. Of course, you can still experiment with blend modes. Maybe overlay looks good, or you can go strong with multiply. I'll stick with multiply for now. Let's check how it looks in Blender. I'll save the file first. Go to File, then Save As. Instead of a PaintNet file, I'll choose PNG. I already have a file here. I'll just click it. Otherwise, name it appropriately or not. Mine says AO at the end, but it's not actually ambient occlusion. It's a diffuse texture. Click Save and confirm with Yes. Flatten merges all layers into one. If you want to keep working right away, just press Ctrl Z and undo to get all the layers back. I just noticed I didn't have the AO layer enabled and the UV layout was still on. That doesn't make sense. So I'll quickly repeat the process and press undo to restore everything for further editing. Now I'll jump back in. I need to set up my material again and see the chair as it is now. I'm actually quite satisfied with it. There's one more thing that could be improved. The ambient occlusion could use a slight blur to better show the shadowing around these areas. I'll duplicate it and name it AO Backup. I'll turn it off for now. Then I'll apply a slight blur to the ambient occlusion, not too strong. I really liked the grainy look, but now we have a bit more shading around these areas. There's nothing stopping me from making the blurred ambient occlusion weaker and layering the original less strong version on top. That way we keep some of the noisy texture of the chair. I can save this again as a PDN file and then as a PNG. Now, I have the grainy texture back, but still have that nice shading. Interestingly, it even fits pretty well with the precision at the edges. Overall, I'm happy with this result. Let's quickly talk about the material setup and a small special feature. In the shading, we have this simple material setup, nothing fancy. The important thing is to use a diffuse shader, not a principled BSDF shader. Not that one, but this one here. Then, for the texture, set the filter method to closest. Not linear, not cubic. Closest. Down here, we have a color attribute that I multiply with the texture. This is a mix color node, which I set to multiply. I set the factor to 1, so it takes 100% of these values. What is a color attribute? It's vertex color. In vertex paint mode, we can define vertex colors at certain corners. For example, I'll quickly go into edit mode and select this. Switch back to vertex paint mode. And then, by activating this, I can assign colors to individual vertices. I'll set it to black here and then. Under Paint, Set Vertex Color. I can color this area. That's a bit too strong, so let's make it gray. Of course, you can also use this for other spots, like these parts. Here's a quick trick. If you do this and then press Ctrl and minus on the numpad, you can shrink the selection. Then we can switch back to vertex select mode and use Ctrl X to set the vertex color. Since I already have shading down here, this is a bit too much at the bottom, but up here it works fine, in my opinion. So I'll deselect this down here and press Ctrl X to set the color only up here. I can also select an entire face and then use Ctrl X to set the vertex color. I think this turned out to be a very successful retro shader. That's it for this part. I hope the tutorial was easy to understand. We only used Freeware for this, and it brings back the good old days with this classic workflow.